The room was tense, silent, except for the soft rustle of papers and the occasional nervous breath. Ethan sat at the edge of the polished mahogany table, his hands folded in his lap, trying to appear calm, but inside his heart raced. It was the day of his grandfather's will reading, a moment everyone had been waiting for with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Ethan had always been close to his grandfather. The man had been a quiet force in his life, the kind of presence that demanded respect without needing to shout. Ethan admired him, trusted him, and even loved him in ways that were hard to explain. He had known that this day would come, but he had never imagined it would feel like a trap. Around the room, family members shifted in their seats. Some whispered, others exchanged subtle glances. Richard, Ethan's father, sat stiffly at the head of the table, his face a mask of composure. Ethan had always known his father to be proud, even controlling, but he had never realized how far that pride could stretch, how it could turn into something dangerous. Richard's eyes flicked toward the envelope on the table, the one the attorney had slid forward with deliberate precision. There was an unspoken tension in that glance, something almost like fear or maybe calculation. Ethan caught it and didn't flinch. The attorney cleared his throat and began to speak, outlining the terms of the will. Ethan barely heard the words. All he could think about was the envelope before him. He reached for it slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the contents. His eyes widened slightly when he saw the check. $38 million, written neatly in his grandfather's handwriting. The number was staggering, almost impossible. For a moment, the room went quiet as the magnitude of the inheritance sank in. Ethan's pulse quickened. He felt a surge of something: gratitude, disbelief, anticipation. It was a gift beyond measure, a reward for the loyalty and care he had shown his grandfather over the years. But the moment was cut short. Richard, who had been sitting like a statue, suddenly moved. He reached across the table and took the check from Ethan's hands. The action was so sudden and unexpected that it knocked the breath out of everyone in the room. Ethan froze, his mind racing to process what was happening. His father's face was calm, almost serene, but there was a sharp edge to it, a deliberate motion that hinted at control and intention. Without a word, Richard lifted the check toward a candle flickering on the table. The flame licked the paper, and in seconds it caught fire. Ethan watched as the edges curled, blackened, and disintegrated into ash. The check, the inheritance, the symbol of his grandfather's final trust, was gone. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, accusations, chaos filled the space. Some relatives leaned forward in shock. Others whispered furiously. The attorney's face was pale, his hands raised as if he could somehow reverse what had just happened. "Richard, stop! That's illegal." But Richard didn't stop. He lowered his hand, eyes fixed on the burning paper, his expression unreadable. There was no hesitation, no remorse, only a cold, deliberate certainty that left everyone else in stunned silence. Ethan, in contrast, didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He simply stared at the ashes and smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It wasn't even a smile of disbelief. It was something else, quiet, controlled, almost frightening in its calmness. A smile that held 1,000 unspoken words. Ethan felt a strange clarity in that moment, a mix of hurt and understanding, a realization that what had just happened was more than money. It was a message. His father's action was not just about the check. It was about control, about power, about sending a signal that no one, not even his own son, could challenge him. Richard's pride had twisted into a need to dominate, and Ethan understood, with painful precision, that his father truly believed he was in the right. "Dad," Ethan whispered, though he wasn't sure if he expected a response. Richard finally looked at him, and in that gaze, Ethan saw conviction. "He had no right to give you all of that," Richard said, voice firm, almost gentle in its harshness. "Not when I'm the one who built everything he ever wanted." There was no apology in his words. There was no hesitation. Only justification. Richard believed his actions were protecting the family, preserving the legacy, maintaining order. But Ethan knew better. He felt the betrayal like a physical weight pressing on his chest. His grandfather had trusted him, had wanted him to have this inheritance. And now, in one sweeping motion, Richard had destroyed it. Ethan's mind raced. He thought of all the moments leading up to this, of the years he had spent with his grandfather, the conversations, the lessons, the quiet afternoons filled with guidance and warmth. He thought of the subtle ways Richard had always undermined him, the small dismissals, the silent judgments, the constant need to prove superiority. And now, here it was, made explicit. Richard had burned not just a check, but a symbol of recognition, of trust, of love. Ethan's chest tightened, but the tightening was accompanied by a strange sense of clarity. The moment demanded more than just reaction. It demanded thought. And that's when the idea of revenge, faint at first, began to take shape. It wasn't a plan yet, not a strategy. It was a seed, planted deep in the soil of anger and betrayal. Ethan felt it grow slowly, insidiously. He could destroy Richard. He could make him feel the same helplessness, the same shock, the same loss. But even as that thought formed, he held himself in check. He smiled again, this time consciously, not because he was pleased, but because he needed to hide what he was feeling. He needed to keep his composure, to show no weakness, no vulnerability. Richard might have won the battle, but the war, the one burning silently in Ethan's mind, had only just begun. The rest of the will reading passed in a blur. Ethan's relatives murmured, speculated, and whispered behind hands. Some tried to comfort him, others shot curious glances at Richard. The attorney finalized the proceedings, but Ethan's attention was elsewhere. He was already calculating, already observing, already imagining possibilities. Richard had made his move openly, recklessly even. And in doing so, he had revealed his own weaknesses. Every gesture, every word, every controlled expression had given Ethan clues about the man his father truly was. When the reading ended, Ethan stood quietly, his hands in his pockets. He looked at the remnants of the check in the small pile of ash on the table. He didn't feel powerless. He felt sharp, alert, determined. He had been wronged, yes, but he had also been shown the precise shape of the challenge before him. He didn't speak to Richard as the room emptied, didn't engage in argument or confrontation. He simply nodded, quietly, and walked away. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and distant city streets. Ethan's mind was alive with thoughts. He thought about his grandfather, about the lessons he had taught, about the integrity and wisdom that had guided him. He thought about his father, about pride, control, and the lengths people go to justify their actions. And he thought about himself, about the seed of revenge that now pulsed quietly in his chest. He knew the road ahead would be complicated. Revenge wasn't simple. It never was. But one thing was clear: Ethan would not be the same. Something had shifted in him. Something irreversible. The burning of the check had been a betrayal. Yes, but it had also been a revelation. And in that revelation lay a power that was just beginning to awaken. Ethan smiled again, faintly, almost imperceptibly. Not in joy, not in satisfaction, but because he understood something fundamental. The game had changed, and he was ready to play. After the will reading, the house felt colder than it ever had before. Ethan moved through the rooms almost invisibly, watching his father interact with the relatives, hearing the faint hum of polite conversations mixed with whispers of gossip. Richard carried himself with a carefully constructed calm, telling people he had protected the family's interests. But Ethan saw through it. Every word, every gesture was a mask. And behind that mask was the fear of what could happen if someone, anyone, struck back. Ethan's mind, meanwhile, was alive with possibilities. He replayed the burning check over and over, not out of obsession but as a study. He noticed the way his father's hand didn't tremble, the quiet satisfaction in his eyes, the way he had controlled the room's reaction. Richard had been deliberate, methodical. It was more than anger. It was strategy. Ethan felt a pang of admiration he couldn't admit, mixed with the simmering anger that had taken root inside him. It wasn't just betrayal, it was an insult to everything he had worked for, everything his grandfather had trusted him with. For days after, Ethan walked through life carefully, like a predator observing his surroundings. He didn't speak much, didn't engage unless necessary. He worked quietly, keeping his emotions hidden, while letting the tension inside grow. He studied his father's patterns, his habits, the subtle cracks in his armor. Richard was careful, yes, but he had weaknesses, small ones, moments when his pride led him to overreach. Ethan catalogued each one in his mind. Every conversation with his father, every meeting he attended, every glance from Richard became a piece of the puzzle. Ethan wasn't acting impulsively. He was preparing. He thought about revenge constantly. Sometimes it came as a vivid image. Richard losing control of his business, his wealth slipping through his fingers, his pride shattered in front of the same people who had watched him burn the check. Ethan imagined the moment, the look on his father's face, the recognition of vulnerability. The thought sent a thrill through him, but also a deeper reflection. Was that what he really wanted? To destroy his father in the same way his father had tried to destroy him? Or was there another path, one that could change the game without leaving him hollow? Late at night, Ethan sat in his study, the city lights casting long shadows on the walls. He pulled up financial statements he had access to through his grandfather's old contacts, information that Richard had assumed he couldn't reach. He analyzed every number, every transaction, looking for patterns, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. He discovered cracks he hadn't expected. Richard's empire, though powerful in appearance, relied on fragile alliances and fragile trust. Ethan's pulse quickened at the realization. The potential to strike was there, but he also felt a warning inside him, a whisper from his grandfather's voice he remembered clearly. Power without purpose is empty. Strength without control destroys you. Ethan's struggle wasn't only practical. It was psychological. He wrestled with a storm of emotions. Anger burned like fire, sharp and insistent. The desire for revenge demanded attention, whispered in quiet moments, filling him with thoughts of satisfaction. But alongside it was another force, subtler, quieter, but no less compelling. Conscience, morality, the voice that urged him to rise above the impulse. If he acted on anger, would he become his father, hardened, relentless, willing to hurt those he loved for pride or principle? That question haunted him constantly. He also considered his father's perspective. Richard had believed, genuinely, that he was protecting the family. That belief didn't make the act any less destructive, but it complicated Ethan's anger. Revenge felt justified, yes, but when he imagined himself in his father's shoes, Ethan saw the weight of fear, of pride, of obsession with control. His father had been right in one way. Ethan had grown into a capable, independent person, someone Richard could no longer fully dominate. That realization fueled the tension inside him. Richard's need to control had collided with Ethan's ability to act independently, and the collision had left both of them exposed, vulnerable in ways neither had anticipated. Every encounter with Richard became a careful dance. Ethan listened, observed, absorbed. He noticed the subtle signs of weakness. A flicker of frustration when his father assumed authority. The hesitation when discussing certain business deals. The way he flinched slightly when someone questioned his judgment. Ethan catalogued them, not out of malice at first, but out of understanding. Yet the understanding slowly transformed into planning. He thought about every possible move, every potential outcome, imagining scenarios in which he could assert himself, reclaim what was stolen, and teach his father a lesson without destroying himself in the process. The duality of revenge and restraint became a constant presence in Ethan's mind. He imagined the thrill of retaliation, the sharp satisfaction of making Richard feel the same loss and helplessness he had felt. But he also imagined the aftermath, the resentment, the bitterness, the chain reaction of harm that might spiral out of control. Each scenario was carefully weighed, each possibility dissected. The more he thought, the more he realized that revenge, while satisfying in the short term, could become a prison. It could trap him in anger, in bitterness, in a cycle that never ended. And yet, the desire burned bright, insistent, undeniable. Ethan started testing himself. Small interactions with his father became exercises in control and observation. He kept his emotions hidden, even when provoked. He responded to insults with calmness, to manipulations with neutrality. In those moments, he felt a power he hadn't known before, the power of patience, of strategy, of knowing that the ultimate move had not yet been made. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Every day he learned more about restraint, about timing, about the difference between acting impulsively and acting deliberately at the same time. Richard was unaware of the storm brewing within his son. He carried on as if he had won, as if burning the check had ended the conflict. He spoke confidently to relatives, shared stories of how he had saved Ethan from making mistakes, and smiled proudly. But Ethan saw through the facade. Richard's composure was brittle. Beneath it lay fear, anxiety, and the unspoken realization that Ethan was no longer a child to be controlled. Each measured word, each calculated smile from Ethan chipped away at the illusion of control that Richard had relied upon for so long. Ethan spent hours walking the city streets, thinking, analyzing, planning. He considered timing, method, consequences. He thought about how revenge could be precise, surgical, and controlled like a chess move rather than a sledgehammer. But with each plan, the voice of restraint whispered, "Is it worth it?" That question became his obsession. He had the skills, the knowledge, the access to strike, but the cost weighed on him. He thought about his grandfather's lessons, about integrity, about the long-term consequences of acting on anger. Every time he imagined the immediate satisfaction of revenge, he reminded himself of the bigger picture. By the end of the week, Ethan had reached a new clarity. He understood that the path forward wasn't simple. He had power, but he also had choice. He could strike and feel momentary satisfaction, or he could hold back, let his father's actions reveal themselves naturally, and choose a response that preserved his own integrity. The tension was constant, almost unbearable, but it refined him. He moved with purpose, watched with precision, and listened with attention. Every step he took was deliberate, every thought measured. He wasn't acting yet, but he was ready. The storm had built to a simmer, waiting for the moment when the decision would have to be made. And so, Ethan waited. Not out of hesitation, but out of strategy. He let the anger fuel him, but he did not let it consume him. He let the betrayal sharpen his mind, focus his observation, and heighten his awareness. The burning check had been more than an act of destruction. It had been an invitation. Ethan accepted it, not with immediate retaliation, but with the patience to understand, to plan, and to prepare for a choice that would define him. Every night, he returned to the image of the check in flames. He imagined the look on his father's face if roles were reversed. He imagined the satisfaction of justice, but also the emptiness it might bring. He imagined walking away, intact, strong, free from the chains of revenge. The choice was clear in his mind, even if the action was not. He was at the edge of something transformative, standing between rage and wisdom, poised to act or to hold back. Ethan knew one thing with certainty. The story was far from over. The betrayal had been the spark. The conflict was the fire. And what came next would test everything he believed about justice, power, and himself. The storm raged outside as Ethan stood in the doorway of his father's office. Rain pounded against the windows, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the pulse in his chest. Inside, Richard sat behind the massive desk, papers neatly stacked, the air of authority surrounding him as usual. But Ethan had seen behind that facade. He knew the cracks, the weaknesses, the moments where pride became a trap. Tonight, everything would come to a head. Ethan held a folder in his hands, thick with documents, evidence, and financial records he had gathered over weeks. Every detail of Richard's empire, every dependency, every fragile partnership, every potential misstep, it was all there. With a single call, a single move, he could dismantle everything his father had built. The power was intoxicating, but also terrifying. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, weighing every outcome, imagining the look of shock on his father's face, the satisfaction, the justice. Richard looked up as Ethan entered, his eyes narrowing. "Ethan," he said, his voice calm but tinged with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" There was an edge to the question, a quiet fear that Ethan could sense immediately. His father had always believed he controlled the situation, that he could manipulate, dominate, and predict. But Ethan had changed. He was no longer a boy to be managed, no longer a son to be dismissed. He was the storm Richard hadn't anticipated. Ethan stepped forward, placing the folder on the desk with deliberate care. "I wanted you to see this," he said, his voice steady, controlled, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking to the top sheet, scanning, realizing the magnitude of what lay before him. Color drained from his face as he recognized the depth of knowledge his son possessed, the precision of his preparation. This is impossible," Richard muttered, disbelief and fear creeping into his tone. He flipped through the pages, trying to understand, trying to dismiss what he saw. But the evidence was undeniable. Ethan had planned, observed, and documented every vulnerability, every potential failure, every misstep his father had made or might make. He had power in his hands, the kind of power that could topple empires. Ethan watched his father closely, seeing the flicker of emotion beneath the controlled exterior. Fear, regret, recognition. Richard had always believed himself untouchable, the master of his domain, the architect of control. But now, he realized that the son he had underestimated could wield influence as carefully, as deliberately, as he could. And unlike Richard, Ethan's aim wasn't destruction for pride, it was choice, strategy, and clarity. For a moment, silence filled the room. The rain pounded harder against the windows, the storm outside matching the tension inside. Ethan felt the pull of revenge, the temptation to strike. To make Richard feel the helplessness he had felt when the check burned. It would be easy. Too easy. He could destroy, humiliate, exact justice with one calculated move. The satisfaction would be immediate, sharp, unforgettable. But the voice of restraint whispered in his mind, steady and firm, reminding him of the cost, the chain, reaction of bitterness that might follow, the darkness it could invite into his own soul. Richard finally spoke again, voice trembling slightly, betraying the vulnerability he tried to mask. If you use this, everything I've built, it will collapse. Do you understand? His eyes searched Ethan's, looking for anger, for betrayal, for malice. He wanted to find the son he thought he knew, the boy he could manipulate, control, or intimidate. But he saw none of that. He saw someone else entirely, someone calm, deliberate, unshaken, someone who had the power but chose to hold it. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand, he said quietly. I could destroy you if I wanted. I could make you feel the same shock, the same helplessness, the same loss you made me feel. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting Richard absorb the weight of them. But I won't. Richard's hands shook slightly as he placed the folder back on the desk. The reality of what Ethan could have done pressed down on him like a weight he hadn't known existed. For the first time, he realized that his son had surpassed him, not just in knowledge or preparation, but in judgment, in control, in the ability to choose. Richard had acted out of pride and fear. Ethan acted out of clarity and strength. The contrast was undeniable, humbling, terrifying. I thought I was protecting you, Richard said finally, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I didn't see what I was doing. I thought I was preserving the family. I didn't realize I was destroying yours. Regret laced every word, but Ethan didn't speak. He let his father confront his own actions, let him feel the weight of acknowledgement. There was no victory in humiliation. The lesson had to come from reflection. Ethan exhaled, a long, deliberate breath. He felt the anger, the desire for revenge, the temptation to strike. It was all there, pulsating like a storm within him. But he also felt something stronger, control, awareness, and a quiet understanding that true power was not in destruction but in choice. He stepped back from the desk, leaving the folder untouched, a symbol of restraint as much as of capability. This ends here, he said, his voice firm. Not because you deserve mercy, not because I forgive you yet, but because I choose to walk away from revenge. I choose to define my own actions, my own path, my own integrity. He turned toward the door, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the office, each step deliberate, marking his independence. Richard remained seated, staring at the folder, staring at the empty space where his son had stood. He felt relief, yes, but also fear, respect, and an unfamiliar humility. The man who had believed himself untouchable now understood that power without wisdom could be fragile. Ethan's choice had revealed more about strength than any act of revenge ever could. As Ethan left the office, the storm outside began to ease, the rain softening into a gentle drizzle. The world felt different, somehow lighter. The tension that had gripped him for weeks, the swirling conflict of anger and strategy began to settle. He had faced the ultimate decision, to destroy or to walk away. He had chosen the latter, and in that choice he found clarity, peace, and a new understanding of himself. Walking through the empty halls of the house, Ethan reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal, the anger, the planning, the temptation, all of it had been real, intense, unavoidable. But the power he discovered was not in retaliation. It was in restraint. It was in the ability to hold the storm within and decide its course. By choosing not to strike, he had preserved himself, preserved his values, and preserved the possibility of a future untainted by bitterness. Later, Ethan stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker through the mist. He thought of his grandfather, of the lessons he had taught, of the integrity he had exemplified. In that quiet reflection, he felt a connection, a sense of approval, as if the man who had guided him from the beginning had been silently watching, quietly satisfied. Revenge could have been sweet, satisfying in the short term, but it would not have healed the deeper wound. The choice to walk away was harder, but it was real, lasting, and transformative. Ethan understood something fundamental that night. Power, anger, and betrayal are fleeting. The true measure of strength is not in striking back, but in mastering oneself, in choosing the path that aligns with values and long-term purpose. He had been wronged, yes, but he refused to let that wrong define him or his actions. He had taken control in the truest sense, not by destroying, but by deciding. And in that decision, Ethan found a calm he had never known before. The fire that had burned within him, the desire for revenge, the anger, the bitterness, began to fade, replaced by a quiet clarity, a recognition that life could move forward unburdened by destruction. Richard had learned his lesson too, in the silence of reflection, in the realization that his son's strength could never be underestimated, and that actions driven by pride often lead to unexpected consequences. Ethan stepped away from the window, the night air cool against his face. The storm had passed, and with it, a chapter of his life had ended. He didn't feel victorious in the traditional sense. He didn't feel triumphant or empowered by someone else's suffering. He felt something deeper: freedom, clarity, and the knowledge that he had chosen the path that preserved his integrity, his mind, and his future. The confrontation had ended, not in destruction, but in understanding, not in triumph, but in wisdom. And that, Ethan realized, was the kind of power no one could ever take from him.